Greetings and welcome to our daily walk through the scriptures for June the 8th. Your readings for today were in 1 Kings chapter 5 and 6, Acts chapter 7 verses 1 through 29, Psalm 127 1 through 5, and Proverbs chapter 16 verses 28 through 30. Now tomorrow, just as a preview, we're gonna look heavily and kind of look back at today and yesterday and really look at the stoning of Stephen and some of the significant aspects of this and why in some ways the stoning of Stephen was an incredible blessing for the future of the church. But we're going to do that tomorrow. Today, we're going to look at, we're going to look at 1 Kings chapter 5 and 1 Kings chapter 6, because finally, the people of Israel are going to have a specific place to worship God. Now, before this, there's a couple things you need to remember. One, that the people of Israel were a nomadic tribe to start with, okay? So Abraham and all of his kids, all the way up until they were put into slavery in Egypt, they were a nomadic tribe, meaning that they moved around a lot. And that was because they had cattle to take care of. Specifically, they were taking care of sheep. And so they had to move around as the grass grew and as the seasons changed and as they adapted. And so they were nomadic. They moved around. They had no specific place that they worshiped God. You would find various places where they would set up an altar to commemorate and remember something that God had done. But that was not a place where the presence of God manifested himself, if you will. Finally, though, after the Exodus and after Moses and the Israelites began their wandering, God did instruct them to build a temporary dwelling place. We called it the tabernacle. And the tabernacle was literally just a tent temple. And a lot of the designs and a lot of the specifications of the tabernacle translated over into the temple in terms of what different areas were and what they represented and what they signified and the rules that went with that. And so, there's some beautiful parallels there. And God blessed this because he allowed his presence to fill up the tabernacle, okay? And the way that it worked during the Exodus time was that the cloud would camp over the tabernacle until it was time to move, and then the cloud would raise, and they would know, oh, it's time to pitch the tents. So they would pack them up, and they would get ready to go. And they would follow the cloud and the pillar of fire by night, and they would land somewhere else, and God would set them down, and they would sit. So they were still a nomadic tribe. However, when Joshua came and they finally crossed over into the promised land, the people of Israel began to change, and they became permanent residents of modern-day Israel. And what we know as modern-day Israel, but back then was their Israel. And so as they did that, God gave them a couple of instructions. One of them is that they weren't to go worship at the places of other religions. Remember, they were taking over lands from other nomadic tribes, and as that happened, God warned them not to adopt their practices. So in other words, don't go to the places where they worshiped their false gods, and instead you need to worship me where I tell you. The second part of that is that God refused to allow David, who wanted to build him a temple, refused to allow David to do that. We talked about this a few days ago, and that David instead was told, you can make all these plans and do everything you want, but ultimately your son, the peacemaker, is going to do that. Now, we've already seen that Solomon is a peacemaker. He made a treaty with the Pharaoh of Egypt. Now he makes a treaty with Hiram, the king of Tyre. And we see these various treaties happen, and he builds relationships with all of these rulers. And they kind of give tribute back and forth to one another, and Hiram helps Solomon build the temple. And so finally, and it gets very specific in 1 Kings chapter 6, in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. So 480 years, let's think about that for a minute. So the day that the Israelites left Egypt, okay, they wandered around for 40 years. Okay, then there was a 40-year period, or 400-year period, basically, of the judges. Okay, and that was when everyone did what was right in their own eyes after Joshua conquered the land. Okay, then they had the reign of Saul and the reign of David, and now we're finally there at the 480th year, and they begin to go build the temple. And Solomon does it very carefully. He does it very meticulously, And finally, after 7 years of building it, it is completed. And it took a long time because Solomon wanted to make sure that every single bit of it honored God. Solomon's intentions were very good. Solomon was showing his wisdom in recognizing that it was time to build the place, that people were going to come, and God was going to bless it. So this is an important story, though, because this is going to set kind of the foundation for a lot of things. The temple becomes a huge focal point throughout the rest of the Bible in a number of ways. And so it's not something to take lightly. When you read this, you need to read the importance of it and understand why this was such a big deal. But for almost 500 years, they had no central place to worship God. And finally, God has said, this is my place. This is my land. This is the place where you will worship me. Okay, we'll talk more tomorrow.